did this shape the way you acted as a manager when you eventually got back into journalism?
Into managing? It definitely did. I mean, it absolutely did. I was in a position when I was the head of eNCA for many years that I had to send journalists into conflict zones, not just into dangerous areas in South Africa, but I sent one particular reporter and a cameraman to Afghanistan, and they spent a month with the U.S. Marines. We had people in the Sudan. We had people going into conflict zones. We had a particular reporter who covered the Westgate Mall attacks in Nairobi. So we would spend nearly R1 million every year just on kidnap and ransom insurance.
Wow.
We'd send people for special courses on what will happen if you are captured or when you are under fire. You have to give people that kind of training, and then you also need to give them a debrief. You got to give them trauma counselling when they come back. You have to make sure that they are okay. And that didn't happen after Everest. It was almost like a slap on the back. Oh, well done, you covered that expedition. Oh, by the way, Mandela's giving a press conference at 3. Would you mind covering it? Jeez. We didn't have that. And I think that in the 1990s, you were expected to be tough, not to cry, to see what was going on in the country and not to be affected by it. And my peers and my colleagues, and those were my mentors, had all witnessed terrible political violence in this country and never really been given the opportunity for a debrief or any kind of trauma counselling. So that was the way it was, and we all just had to get on with it.
So how did you deal with life after that?
I think I struggled a lot with the experience after Everest, because nothing could compare. So suddenly going to that press conference was the most boring thing on earth. And I think that two things happened. One, I felt kind of wronged by my employer that they didn't understand embedded journalism and the experiences I had to go through, but I didn't have any way of articulating that. It was only when the Gulf War came out and journalists were, particularly the second Gulf War, and journalists were embedded, and there was this huge debate. So I could say, that's what I felt like. That's exactly the debate we should have had when I got back from Everest. But the second thing was I became a bit of a prima donna, actually. Oh God, the story's not like Everest, it doesn't compare. And I think I was probably a bit of a pain to manage for a while. So I packed my bags and I went and worked in Europe for about 18 months and backpacked around and pulled pints in London, and kind of discovered my humility again, and then came back into the newsroom. And I think the danger of young reporters being given very big stories early on is that they don't necessarily cope long term, and second of all, it gives them a false sense of how good and important they are. And in fact, doing the hard yards is the critical thing.
Now I have to bring up this anecdote from the book, the time when you had 7 or 8 beers on the mountain, and you ventured out into these very thin air, and you were drinking water from the river with your iodine tablets that someone was relieving themselves in just meters away. What's it like for you to think that was your life? That was something you did, and you survived it. The whole time I thought, if this was me, I would have been.
Well, I think this was kind of pre the era of bottled water, so you kind of took what you got, and you had to drink a lot of water, and of course you had to get it from the rivers, and of course all the latrines and what have you empty out into the rivers, so the waters are polluted, and you have to drink them with iodine and to purify them that way. But I did make the mistake, as you're right, of when we got to a village called Namche Bazaar and we had the one rest day, indulging in a few beers.
I couldn't believe they
which at high altitude is the wrong thing to do.
No, yeah.
So we had a hell of a party, but it wasn't the wisest thing if you wanted to acclimatize correctly.
Who's the most memorable person from that expedition? The one person you still think about a lot?
Well, I'm still in touch with Deshawn Daisel. We're still very good friends. In fact, she was a speaker at the conference I've just come from. So we're still very much in touch. But I think the person that probably lingers in my mind the most is Bruce Herod. In the sense that, I got to meet him a few times before we left South Africa. I met him on the mountain. He was a very quiet, reserved guy. He was, very experienced in conditions like that. He'd spent many years in the Antarctic. And then on the day when the South Africans summited and made it to the top, and Nelson Mandela phoned camp, he was the only one that hadn't reached the top, and this moment comes when everyone else is descending and he's going up. And he insists that he still wants to go for the top, and Ian Woodall reluctantly agrees. And there's not much you can do on the mountain at that altitude if someone says, I refuse to turn around.
Yeah.
And he presses on. And there, I just don't understand why he switched off his radio, he didn't communicate with us. 2 o'clock was the self-imposed turnaround time where you turn around from the summit. And he didn't do that. For 2 hours he pushed on. 2 o'clock came and went, no radio call. We radioed him, religiously after that. It was only at 5 o'clock that he announces that he's on the summit. And something about that summit just attracted him, to the top and forced him to, he just abandoned the kind of caution that you really, really need at that very high altitude. And while we don't begrudge him the freedom to go for the summit as a climber, that's his right. It did unfortunately mean that he would have to descend in the dark.
Yeah.
He was low on oxygen. He'd probably run out of oxygen before he got to the next oxygen dump waiting for him on the south summit. And tragically he disappeared. And we predicted in base camp that he must have fallen. And it turned out that was true. When his body was found about 18 months later, it was clear that he'd fallen down a section called the Hillary Step, which is a vertical 30-foot rock face. And his body was found at the bottom. And the climber that found him retrieved his camera, so we have the photos of him on the summit, and so can confirm that he actually made it.
Yeah.
And then cut the ropes and let his body slide down the side of the mountain, kind of a mountain burial. And I suppose I just don't quite understand how such a calculating, rational, he was a scientist, how that kind of man could, in that moment, just not be able to make the very clear decisions he needed to in order to survive. And at the end of the day, it cost him his life. He was engaged to be married. His family obviously lost, a son and a brother. And we lost a team member, a valued team member whom we all got to like. And it can really cast a negative kind of pale over the whole South African expedition. And instead of coming home triumphant, the expedition came home under a cloud of controversy.